Gerry Spence is among a handful of great American lawyers who have successfully fought for truth and justice against all odds in the legal arena. He joins a group of other distinguished American lawyers such as Patrick Henry, John Jay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, Clarence Darrow, Thurgood Marshall, and of course, Gerry Spence. To understand what motivates lawyers like these men and Gerry, who have dedicated their lives to seeking justice for the little guy against corporate giants as well as representing the innocent and the damned, the Insider Exclusive is visiting with Gerry right here at his home, the Thunderhead Ranch, and we'll go all the way back to his frontier pioneer beginnings and the evolution of his philosophy about the law, about America, about the government, and about our justice system. It's my great pleasure to introduce Gerry Spence once again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This particular show is about the evolution of you as a lawyer. What incidents might have happened in your youth where you decided that you wanted to represent some of the poor, the unrepresented, the disadvantaged? Why did you decide?
Well, that didn't start all at once, you know. My first goal was to be a big shot lawyer, like all the lawyers in Wyoming. I mean, the big shot lawyers represented insurance companies, and people that represented people, lawyers that represented people were these poor bottom feeders that didn't have anything and didn't have any clientele, that were just out scrubbing around for $1. But the powerful lawyers who represented the Wyoming at the American Bar Association, they represented insurance companies and corporations, and that was the vision of almost every young lawyer. And of course, the lawyers that came out of Wyoming Law School were just nothing. I mean, who ever heard of Wyoming Law School? We had 23 lawyers, I think, who graduated. I used to think that I was such a big shot because I graduated at the top of my class, but there were only 23 of us, don't you understand?
Right.
Anybody that was sort of paying attention might have done the same thing. Mm-hmm. In any event, earlier than that, why did I decide to be a lawyer? Now, it's a very strange thing that, and parents ought to think about this. What is it that influences your child for a life's work? I didn't know any lawyers. I grew up in Sheridan, Wyoming. There weren't any lawyers that my parents knew. None of their friends were lawyers. My parents were very common, very simple people. Didn't need a lawyer, never heard of a lawyer, and we all went to the Methodist church and there wasn't any lawyers that went to the Methodist church. They'd have probably been better people if they had, but I don't remember ever seeing any. And we had the covered dish luncheons and the covered dish suppers and all, but there weren't any lawyers there. And it never occurred to me that I might be a lawyer, except for the fact that I understood that lawyers had to make arguments. I saw movies or something about that. And I understood that lawyers had a more of an exciting life, certainly, than a preacher. My mother wanted me to be a preacher. Well, how would you like to be a preacher, Gerry? Well, all the preachers I knew were sissies. The other thing I could do using vocal skills would be a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I gave my teachers a lot of trouble.
You didn't want a student like you.
And I didn't want to ever be a teacher and give anybody a chance to get even with me. As a matter of fact, I didn't know what I would do if I had a student like Gerry Spence. So when somebody suggested that there might be a person that could be a lawyer, and then I had a friend who I still have, by the way, and we went off to sea. I was 16 years old. The war was just coming to an end, and I was in the Merchant Marines. I was a messman, 16 years old, left home. And he had a book. It was called The Great Mouthpiece, and it was a story written by a famous author at that time by the name of William Fowlin. And he was writing a story about William Fowler, who was the great mouthpiece. And one of the things one of the stories in the book was when Fowler was charged with having bribed a jury. I didn't understand that bribing a jury was bad. I just knew it was against the law. I didn't have any understanding of any of that at 16 years of age. But I thought it was so wonderful that he defended himself. And his defense was elegant. And after the defense was over and he was acquitted, a newspaperman came up to him and said, "Mr. Fowler, what do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "Well, that's the last juror I'll ever bribe." Of course, the issue of double jeopardy was,
Yeah.
and I thought to myself, does a lawyer have that kind of power? And so at a very early age, I began to think about being a lawyer but I didn't know any. So I went to law school.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got out, I was a considerably different proposition than the one I read in The Great Mouthpiece.
Now, initially, you became a prosecutor. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've all sinned.
You saw the light, right?
And yes, I became a prosecutor. I started to work for Franklin B. Sheldon, and in his office, he was a one-man law firm, and he and his wife was his secretary, and they hired me at $200 a month. But I had to do my own typing.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do everything, and I began to do deeds and abstracts and divorces and title opinions and farm leases and then Judge Sheldon got appointed. Franklin B. Sheldon got appointed to the judgeship, and here I was, didn't have a job, didn't have any place to go, so I ran for the prosecuting attorney in the county against a well-established lawyer in Lander. And I did everything. I knocked at every door in the county. I took the telephone book, and it had a little map in it about each town. And these towns were long ways apart. This is a huge, huge county. It's almost as big as Connecticut or something like that. And I would mark every street, and I knocked at every door. And I went out on the reservation, and I did what we call teepee tapping. You know, you'd go up to the teepees and say, "Hey, I'm Gerry Spence, and I'd sure like you to vote for me." And we sit down and we talk, and I developed friends on the reservation, and I'll be a darn damned if this 24-year-old kid didn't get elected to the prosecuting attorney's office. And that's where I began to learn to try cases. Mm-hmm. There weren't any role models then. There were a few lawyers in the community. I can remember when Eddie Moraine, the big-time insurance lawyer in Wyoming, and of course the representative to the American Bar Association, which in those days, and I think still, is more interested in corporate law than they are in human law, came by Fremont County, this county where we're sitting right now, this very county where we're sitting, mm-hmm. to tell us that he wanted to assess us each $25 for a publicity campaign for lawyers that the American Bar Association was putting on. $25 a head. We have to change our image. Now, that was almost 60 years ago. We had to change our image. Do you hear me? 60 years ago, we had to change our image. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting there, this silly young lawyer, and I go like this. And he says, yes. And I said, well, Mr. Moraine, you want people to see us better? He said, yes. I said, well, then why don't we just do better?
There's a connection.
Why don't we just do better? And he kind of had a way of saying like that, and that was his answer. Mm-hmm. And he went on to talk, well, like $25 was, for $25 I had to examine an abstract, write a title opinion, write a deed, a mortgage, and a note, and take on the liability, which I had nothing anyway, but take on the liability of any mistakes that I made for $25.
Took it very seriously.
Yeah, and I had a wife and 2 kids by that time.
Mm-hmm. You went on to represent some insurance companies.
And then, did I become a great trial lawyer? I started beating the insurance companies. Mm-hmm. And of course, when you beat the insurance companies, you know what they do. They come and hire you.
Yeah.
So they came and hired. They said, and for a while, I represented insurance. I went home, I can remember, I said to my wife, honey, I have finally made it. Here we are. I am a big-time lawyer. I got hired by the insurance companies, and I did. And like I say, we have all sinned from time to time. That was one of mine.
I understand there came a defining moment in your life when you actually met a client of the insurance company who had been denied coverage. He had, his leg had been amputated or something like that.
And I can remember I wanted to impress Imogene. And I said, my wife, I said, now I want you to come to court and watch. I'm going to cross-examine this. I'm representing the insurance company. And I'm sitting over here is my client, who is not the insurance company as far as the jury's concerned. The insurance company is the one back here hidden behind the client.
Sure.
And we're not permitted under the law to tell the jurors that the defendant is insured. And that if the jury gives us $1 million, the insurance company will have to pay it. We can't do that. What the jury sees, this is the great lie, hear me, the great lie of the law. And here's my little client, and I've turned her into a poor little helpless floozy, and she's got a little straw hat on, and she's sitting there all helpless. And here is a multi-million-dollar insurance company behind her. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to cross-examine the plaintiff. She was drunk, and she ran into him and crippled him to the place where and he was an old man who'd worked all of his life in a refinery in Casper, Wyoming. His life was over, and what he wanted to do with what was left of his life was go out with his grandkids and go fishing and have some time with his family. Instead, all he got was a bucket of pain. So I began to cross-examine him, and by the time I finished the cross-examination, he didn't look well. He didn't look good. And the jury returned a verdict against him. And I looked up, and Imogene was gone out of the courtroom. And I thought, what the heck happened to her? And I left, and I ran out of the courtroom. It was a recess, and ran down the hall. There she was. I could see her little fanny just going down the wall, or the hallway that way, and I hollered, and she stopped, and I said, where are you going? And she says, I'm out of here. And I said, why? She says, that just disgusted me, what you did to that poor old man.
How did that sound?
Well, that evening we were at the Safeway store getting some groceries for a celebration. And lo and behold, in front of me was this old man. And he turned around, and I looked at me, and he was as close to me then as you are to me, and that's as close as I'd ever gotten to him. And I could see his eyes, and I saw the eyes of a human being. And I could see his sad face, and I could see the pain that he had.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what he said to me? He said, I said, I'm sorry, sir, but that it turned out that way. He said, oh, Mr. Spence, that's all right. You were just doing your job. And I picked up his groceries, and I carried them to the car for him. And that night, Imogene and I are in bed, and I say to Imogene, is that my job? Cheating old men out of justice, is that my job?
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't answer. Now, these women, you have to be careful of these women, you understand, because they're smarter than we. And they know when to talk and when not to say anything. And the next morning, I got up having slept on that question. And I called up my partner, Bob Rose, who later became the Chief Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court. And I said, Bob, we've got to quit doing this. And he said, Gerry, you're right. And we sent out 30, 40 letters to insurance companies that we represented, and we said, you have to find somebody else to do that job. And that was the turning point in my life.
And thank God that happened, right? You, unlike many lawyers, write a lot of books that sometimes relate to your cases. And I want to walk through some of the books and the cases you had and tell me why you wrote them and tell our audience. For example, Gunning for Justice. What inspired you to write that book?
Well, you know, Gunning for Justice, most of it occurred right here on this ranch. There was Ed Cantrell, who was charged with murder of his deputy. And that was the case where he turned around in the automobile just before the deputy, in the police car, just before the deputy was to testify the next morning and against the sheriff and to tell everybody what was going on in the sheriff's department in Rock Springs. And Ed Cantrell shot him right between the eyes.
And you represented him.
And I said, Ed, I said, we're talking right down there in that shed, and I said, Ed, how did you feel when you saw that pretty little bullet hole come right between his eyes? He said, well, Gerry, that's how he sounded. Well, Gerry, it felt plumb good. He said, you know, Gerry, some folks just need killing. The defense was self-defense,
yeah.
And I think it was an honest defense. There was this guy was an undercover agent, and he was half crazed,
mm-hmm.
and his gun was unsnapped,
mm-hmm.
he was in the back seat, and it was unsnapped when he was found, and when the officers got to him. There were two other officers in the car that were there as well. So at that same time, I was appointed the special prosecutor to prosecute a fellow by the name of Mark Hopkinson, who had killed a good friend of mine, another lawyer, blown him up, blown him while he was asleep, blown him to pieces with a bomb. And his little darling wife and his boy, 15-year-old boy, killed 3 of them. And then killed one of our witnesses.
And you represented him.
And I was appointed by the judge to prosecute him.
Mm-hmm.
Because the FBI couldn't solve the crime, and nobody else seemed to be able to solve the crime, but it was very easy for us to solve the crime. We called the first grand jury in Wyoming. We didn't have grand juries in those days, and I called one. Mm-hmm. We called it, found out. That's a story in itself. But here I am at this ranch at this same time. At this same time, I am defending Ed Cantrell against the state And on the other side, I am representing the state against Mark Hopkinson.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed Cantrell was so respected by the officers around here, and Mark Hopkinson, who had done all these killings, threatened my life and the life of my family. And we had officers around, posted up all around, trying to make sure that the old man didn't get killed before we got to court. It's a story in itself.
There was another book you wrote of murder and madness. Tell us why you wrote that book and a little bit about the evolution of writing that book.
Well, that's the book about Joe Esquivel.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Joe Esquivel was a big, handsome Mexican kid who shot his wife, his white wife, in the presence of a half a dozen eyewitnesses, including a deputy sheriff with his gun drawn.
Mm-hmm.
Joe just walked up and shot her. When she said, "Go ahead and shoot me, I don't think you have the courage to do it," and he just pulled the gun and shot her. Right like that. And it was a defense of insanity. And I tried that case 3 times. 2 times we said that he wasn't ready to go to trial. Why would I do that? Let me show you why defense lawyers do what they do. Let me tell you where that story began. It began in a boxcar in Rawlins, Wyoming. You can see it. It's nighttime. The cinders in the old engines from the old coal-burning engines are blowing all over. It's cold. It's very cold. And there is a siding, and off on the siding are some old boxcars.
Mm-hmm.
And if you walked up to one of the boxcars, and they're about this high off the ground, the opening, to get up in it, you have to jump up. And if you peered up in there, here's what you would see. In the dim light from the lights of the railroad yards, you would see a little Mexican woman lying on her back in a dirty boxcar, having sex with one of the railroad operators, one of the railroad brakemen. And in front was a little boy sitting there, watching. Maybe he's 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, with snot running out of his nose, and him scared to death. Now the question is who was the first victim? And that's where that case began. Who was the first victim?
Mm-hmm.
And the jury found that he was insane, was unable to stand trial at that time.
Yes.
And then, secondly, after a while, the state decided that he was sent to the state hospital, and the state hospital had cured him. And they decided to
try him again.
Second time, the jury said, no, he's still insane. But finally, Joe said to me, Jerry, I can't stand this anymore in the hospital. I'd rather be in the pen if they're going to get me, so just take me off. Let's try it. Let's go to court. And I did. And the jury found that he was not guilty by reason of insanity and turned him loose.
Oh, really?
And that I said, Joe, you have to get out of Rawlins.
Yes.
You have to leave Rawlins.
Yes.
He promised me he would. The first thing he did was to go down to one of the Rawlins bars and get into a fight. And the bartender shot him, killed him. And I can remember my old friend Tom Fagan saying a truth that all trial lawyers and people need to hear. You can't beat the big one. The big one is murder. Even when you beat it with a jury, you can't beat the big one. Mm-hmm. Joe Esquivel didn't beat it. I defended, as you just said, Cantrell. He died in an unhappy conditions, situations. Take a look at O.J. Simpson.
Right.
What's happened to him?
In jail.
You cannot beat the big one.
The big one. One other book, which a case originated, The Smoking Gun.
Well, that's a case. Was another pro bono case. A woman had been charged with the murder of a poor woman, a very, very poor woman, Sandy Jones, charged with the murder of a real estate developer. Mm-hmm. And again, the defense was self-defense. And more important, there was the evidence was ultimately that maybe she didn't do the killing, that maybe he was shot accidentally by another person that was there. So the jury acquitted her. Mm-hmm. She I don't think was guilty of the big one. Mm-hmm. And she's still living a very interesting spiritual life in Oregon.
If you had to say one thing to all the trial lawyers out there, anybody who aspires to be a lawyer, what 3 bits of advice would you give them to be great trial lawyers?
Do I have to come up with 3?
Try 2. Whatever you want.
Well, don't do it for the money. Mm-hmm. Because very few people get wealthy from that process. And don't do it for any other reason except that you have to.
I've enjoyed having you on the show, and thank you for sharing.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about Gerry Spence and the Trial Lawyers College, as well as some of our other shows at www.insiderexclusive.tv. Thank you.